Yeah. I was looking under it. Okay, well, welcome everyone, and sorry we're a little bit delayed, but thanks for joining us, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm the Senior Vice President here, and the Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security here at the Council, and we're very excited about this conversation on the Maldives and its implications for the broader Indo-Pacific. This is a joint effort at the Atlantic Council. The Council has 12 centers, and Bharath Gopalaswamy, I think I pronounced that right for the first time, is the director of the South Asia Center, and so this is a joint effort. We're going to do a lot more because there is a lot of interest and policy sort of innovation on this frame of the Indo-Pacific, which I was very thrilled to hear in the President's of the United States in his Da Nang speech late last year. When he was traveling. The Scowcroft Center has been growing the Atlantic Council's Asia portfolio, but we've been focusing particularly on Northeast Asia, a lot going on with Korea and China and Japan, and a lot of senior delegations going there, et cetera. And in particular, we've been looking at security, trade and economy, and disruptive technologies. If you're interested, we can certainly talk to you more about that. But with our partnership, as I said, with the South Asia Center, we're shifting our focus a bit more to include discussions outside that sort of traditional framework. And we're very grateful for the South Asia Center for their support, and look forward to a lot more work together with them. And so in that spirit, I think you all know the topic for today's discussion. I won't dwell on it, but the Maldives has been under a state of emergency since February 5th of this year. And there's a lot of uncertainty over the stability of the region, and the security of the Maldives is particularly important to that. It's not a regional power in its own right, obviously, but it's a very significant element in China's efforts in the region, and certainly in Indian and American efforts to align and deal with China's challenge and potentially opportunities. This is a very important discussion for the broader U.S. policy community. All of this activity raises key questions, such as, are there steps that India and the United States can take bilaterally to help strengthen democratic institutions and the rule of law in the Maldives? How might India and the United States look to help consolidate a rules-based security architecture around the Maldives and in the region to promote regional security? These are the types of very broad questions, but I'm sure we'll get much deeper. And so to do this, we've convened a very distinguished group of former officials and experts and journalists. And so you'll see the speakers today coming at it from a wide variety of perspectives. There's more that I could say in terms of the importance of the region, the three of the world's largest economies, 7 of its 8 fastest growing markets, but I think what I would like to do is get more to the meat. We don't have a lot of time for a set of important issues, and so I think with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator, whom I just met, but she is the Washington correspondent for the Economic Times. She'll introduce the other speakers, and then we'll take it from there. So thank you very much again.
Thank you, Barry. So we have with us Mr. Ahmed Naseem, and he's a former foreign minister of the Maldives. He has represented the Maldives at the United Nations. He was the Director General of Investments at the Foreign Investment Services Bureau. He's written many articles. He's about to publish a book on tourism in the Maldives. He joined the Maldivian Democratic Party in 2005 and has represented the party in the United Kingdom, European Union, and the United States. He has also served on the board of directors for the Regional Center for Strategic Studies in Colombo. Um, then we have Mr. Franklin Kramer. He's a distinguished fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. He's a national security and international affairs expert and a member of the Atlantic Council's board of directors and a distinguished fellow. He's been a senior political appointee in 2 administrations, including as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security for President Clinton, Secretary Perry, and Secretary Cohen, and as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. I'm a columnist for the Economic Times. I've lived in DC for several years. So we start off the discussion. I'd like Mr. Naseem to first sort of give us an overview of the turmoil in the Maldives right now. We know we have a state of emergency there. A lot of MPs and judges are under arrest. And the international community, by and large, has been absent or hasn't said very strong things. So if you could give us an overview and then and how you look at the role of China.
Yes. Can I take this?
Yes.
Well, thank you, Seema. I think I should introduce my delegation here. We have Mali Jamal, who is the former minister in the government, and we have Siddhartha Sharif. She was also a former state minister in the government, and we have Tilmiza, who was the former deputy permanent representative in New York, and also the deputy ambassador to Washington. And I have here Mahmoud Hamid, who is a lawyer by profession, and he represents many people who are at the moment in jail. So I think it's my pleasure to meet all of you, and thank you for this. I don't know how I can cope with all the gentlemen here. I don't know if I have enough knowledge or enough. I'm in exile. I've been in exile for the last 4 years in Sri Lanka. I've decided there. But I would like to start by saying that thank you very much for organizing this Atlantic Council South Asia Center, and I'm extremely grateful. And also, I know what Ambassador Davinda here. My pleasure to see you again, sir, after such a long time. Yes. I'll start by saying I have a prepared statement here. I hope you don't mind if I do that, and we'll have the opportunity to interact later on. Yes. Crisis in Maldives. Implication of our topic of discussion today, or what we are deliberating on, is implication for US policy in the Indo-Pacific. The Chinese dragon and the Indian elephant must not fight each other but dance with each other, China's foreign minister Wang Yi said on 8 March. He was referring to the recent standoff between India and China over their respective positions in the Maldives. In a way, it's strange that these two emerging superpowers are squabbling over Maldives. For as long as I can remember, the Maldives was never in the crosshairs of rival superpowers. We have tended to be overlooked rather than fought over. People dismissed us as too small or too insignificant to bother with. For years, the Maldives was known as a small island state. But perhaps a more accurate description in today's world would be a big ocean state. We're just 460,000 people scattered across 1,200 islands, only 200 of which are inhabited. But our territorial waters are roughly the size of the United Kingdom, and we straddle some of the world's most important shipping lanes. The Maldives is now referred to as the strategically located country, a pawn in a new great game being played out between Asia's two rising superpowers. From a US perspective, you might well ask why you should care about Maldives, or indeed proxy fights between India and China half a world away from the US mainland. But I believe there are 3 reasons why the Maldives is important for American policy in the Indo-Pacific. Firstly, is China's willingness to proactively encourage the leaders of previously democratic countries to embrace authoritarianism. China likes to tell the West not to meddle in the domestic affairs of Asian countries. But in the Maldives, China is only too happy to meddle in our domestic affairs by corrupting the ruling elite and encouraging an authoritarian president to double down on repression. As you may already know, the Maldives is currently in political crisis, as mentioned here. Almost all the democratic gains that we made in the years have been lost since President Yamin assumed power in 2013 under disputed elections. Every opposition leader is in jail or in exile. The military has stormed and now occupies the parliament. Last month, masked officers in riot gear smashed down the doors of the Supreme Court and literally dragged the Chief Justice away along the ground. It's now a full-blown dictatorship. And it is difficult to believe that President Yamin would have dared to do all this, defying India and the West without implicit support of his new best friend, Beijing. Beijing likes dictatorships because dictators are easier to bribe and dictatorships easier to seduce into Chinese death trap. This facilitates Beijing's primary goal, which is a land grab. More specifically, China appears to be keen on building a base in the Maldives, which one day may house warships and submarines. China's standard prescription for land grab have been change state type to autocracy, dismantle transparency and democratic oversight, acquire infrastructure projects, very often vanity projects, roads that lead to nowhere, bridges that don't bridge. Prices of projects are often extremely inflated and financed through commercial loans or supply credit. The receiving country therefore cannot pay back the debt, and that debt is used as a disciplining regime, which is the classical debt trap. When countries can't pay back the debt, they ask for equity, and we end up relinquishing sovereignty. Without firing a single shot, China has grabbed more land than the East India Company. Instead of rifles and cartridges, the weapons in the new colonial arsenal are bribery, corruption, and dubious investments. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't have anything against foreign investment, foreign direct, but there is a process that must be followed in investing in different countries. There should be open tenders, competitive bidding, democratic scrutiny. When deals are made in the dark with despots, the land is sold off without the public knowledge, leaving the country in debt trap to a foreign power for generations. Then it's not foreign direct business, it's land grab. It's not economic, it's politics. This is of grave importance because it affects not just Maldives, but the security and stability of the entire Indian Ocean. In particular, China's actions are undermining India's security concerns. And so what is happening in the Maldives is not just about democracy, it's about peace, stability, and security of the entire neighborhood. The second issue I wanted to raise, which is of relevance to the United States, is the state of deep state. During the last 40 years, a very narrow conservative version of Islam emanated from the Gulf has been propagated in the Maldives, creating a breeding ground for jihadi movements. We are now in a very worrying situation where Maldives has sent the most amount of people per capita than any country to fight for the ISIS. Hundreds of Maldives have joined jihadi groups. This could not have been achieved without a very solid network at home in the Maldives. ISIS has an organized and systematic strategy with the intention of infiltrating and subsequent total control of key departments of the state. ISIS sympathizers are quietly maneuvering themselves into key positions within the security forces, judiciary, various government agencies, and street gangs in the Maldives. This systematic embedding into political, bureaucratic, and social fabric of the country means they are close to effectively running a parallel shadow state, the deep state in the Maldives. Presently, the issue becomes a crisis as the ISIS is being flushed out of Syria and Levant. They are coming home to the Maldives. This, of course, is a tragedy that we must find solutions to. The third and final point I want to mention is President Yamin's criminal activities, which undermine the US-led rule-based international system. Last month, a Maldivian oil tanker was photographed by the Japanese Air Force engaged in suspected sanction busting activities. The Maldives government furiously denied any involvement in the incident, claiming the tanker was using a fake Maldivian flag. But since then, the tanker has been connected to the Maldives, where it is registered, and also to President Yamin's family. We have now learned that a member of Yamin's family used the tanker as collateral in an application for a $4 million mortgage at the Bank of Maldives. The opposition believes, and the Maldivian Democratic Party believes, that Yamin has a fleet of 27 oil tankers which are being used to systematically bust UN sanctions on North Korea. This business model is nothing new for President Yamin. In the early 2000s, he was documented selling bootleg oil to Burmese junta in breach of then UN sanctions. So this is the problem we face in the Maldives. China is propping up and actively encouraging a criminal regime which is busy dismantling the institutions of democracy to cement its rule and busy selling off the country to Beijing. The country is becoming more volatile, more lawless, and more in the grip of Islamic extremists. I don't think things are going to end well unless this regime can be brought to a swift end and democracy restored. The Chinese dragon and the Indian elephant must not fight each other, but dance with each other. Might I add that perhaps the Maldivian tuna would rather be left to swim alone to somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. So from what you say, sounds like Maldives used to pursue the India First policy, even though they say that
Not used to even now because policy.
They say that officially.
Maldives, not this government.
Not this government.
Yes.
Well, okay, let's talk about this government. Now, your party leader asked that India show some strength or send an envoy backed by its military. But the message from Male was India should stay away, and if we need India, we'll call for it. The agriculture minister said it's our internal matter, and if we need help, we'll let India know. Then they equated the situation with Kashmir, in case the Indians didn't get the point. It's interesting that the only country in South Asia that the Indian Prime Minister, who travels a lot, has not visited is the Maldives. The questions that come to mind in light of where we are in Washington, D.C., and the talk of Indo-Pacific and the resurgence or reactivation of the Quad. So I wanted to see if we can move the discussion to in that direction. The Quad is still sort of getting its act together, but could it have issued a joint statement? I wonder. That wouldn't have taken too much effort, but each country issued separate statements. So I wanted to know how you read the U.S. stand on the Maldives in that sense. I know there have been statements, but do you think the situation warrants some stronger statements? Because we read reports that Chinese naval combat force entered the Indian Ocean at the end of January in a clear message, apparently, to India that don't even think of intervening. So the message was very clear. Then there are reports that China is trying to establish a joint ocean observation station in the westernmost atoll, and that's the closest to the Indian coast. And we know that these observation stations can easily evolve into military bases eventually. And if things were to take a turn for the worse, do you see the Chinese sending a quote-unquote humanitarian mission to rescue the Yamin government? if let's say protests continue and if there's a lot of unrest, and if we can invite you to join us and tell us what you think of the whole situation with the Indo-Pacific, all the talk that we have here, that it has to be a free and open Indo-Pacific. I know I've raised a lot of questions all of a sudden, but
So, thank you very much, Mr. Minister. That was very, very useful. And if you will, that was Maldives-centric and looking out from the Maldives. I think what I'll try and do is take a broader perspective and go outside in, starting with perhaps the U.S. strategy and working my way forward. So as has been said multiple times already, a key new element in the U.S. strategy, or at least in the way we talk about it, is Indo-Pacific. And when one looks at the national security strategy or other documents, they even prioritized it regionally. That was the first of the regional elements listed. But the substance so far has been generally based on ongoing sets of activities, the alliances and other sets of activities. So the thing I'd like to talk about a little bit is what new should be included and where we might go, and then work my way down to where the Maldives might fit in. Now, the first thing I think that ought to be said is that there really are what I would call anchor countries for the Indo-Pacific strategy. The United States, of course, but for the countries that are actually in the Indian Ocean or in the Pacific, I think the two most important are Japan, which has talked a great deal about it. The Japanese National Security Advisor was actually here at the Atlantic Council about 2 or 3 weeks ago and gave a very good speech with a series of parameters as to how Japan saw the Indo-Pacific. And the other anchor country, I would say, is India. So we have 2 anchors, or 3 if you want to count the U.S. But then in addition, you mentioned the Quad, but I think we have to go a little broader than the Quad. We have to have a different set of structures, because there are plenty of structures in the Indo-Pacific. There's ASEAN, there's the APEC, EAS, etc. But none of them are highly effective in an overall geopolitical set of activities. The hub and spoke arrangement, if you will, that the U.S. has used for alliances is good for what it is, but it's not a widely dispersed international set of arrangements. So I would say structurally we really want to look at new arrangements building on the Quad, but involving India, Indonesia, Australia, United States, Canada, Republic of Korea, Japan. Each of those are democratic nations that have a lot of convergent interests and all able to work together in different ways and different degrees. But I think it's very important to also create what I would call a positive agenda for the Indo-Pacific. The agenda should not be anti-China, although I'm going to come to that, but it's a positive set of agendas. And so economics, environment, infrastructure, innovation, I think is very important, health. The Japanese talk about connectivity on these kinds of issues, and I think that's a good word. And then there's also security sets of issues. One, of course, is cybersecurity in an integrated world. Another is counterterrorism, which involves almost all of these countries. And then freedom of navigation, obviously relevant to Maldives, but to many others. The second pillar, I would say, that the Indo-Pacific needs to consider is how to involve the private sector in support of this private agenda. Well, the private sector is all over the Indo-Pacific already. We don't really need to tell multinational companies where these countries are. But the question is, how do you incentivize new and expanded sets of activities, say in the environmental area, or in the infrastructure area, or in the innovation area, or in the health area? How do you finance them? Maybe building clusters of groups, which could involve government, laboratories, private sector, academia, focused on different sets of activities. The other ways to go at it. Third area, it is a globalized world. And so even though you call it Indo-Pacific, or if one calls it Indo-Pacific, multiple other countries, and particularly Europeans and North America, have major interests. exemplified perhaps by the many, many trips of the German leaders, UK leaders, and recently, especially President Macron of France. So he was in China not too long ago and laid down markers with respect to the importance of what he called balanced and reciprocal trading approaches. So that wasn't President Trump, that's President Macron, and it's an interesting set of things to think about. And then I'll come back to what I call China's nonconformance. So the U.S., when it's working in the Indo-Pacific, and particularly with respect to smaller countries like Maldives, its key partner really is going to be India. And it's important to work within building out this Indo-Pacific framework. It's important to have actual initiatives that develop with respect to counterterrorism and freedom of navigation. There are a lot of very good U.S.-India communiques. Every time a prime minister from India comes to the United States, or every time a president goes to India, there's a communique, and the communiques are terrific. The question is implementation. So we really need to focus on that and build some direct relationships. The one where India, of course, wants to do more is in the defense relationship, wants to have its major non-native status be implemented in many ways. There's an area where I think there's an awful lot to be done, and that's, if you will, in the overall computer algorithmic defense area. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, neural networks are areas where both the U.S. has terrific capability, but so does India. And as we work our way forward, I think that's an area of great promise. Now, China, on the other hand, I've used the word non-conformance, that's being polite. It has a hybrid strategy, if you want to call it that. It's engaged in various, what might be called microaggressions around the area. And China works in very interesting ways. It doesn't comply with the liberal world order, either in its own country, where it gives unfair advantages to national champions, it forces tech transfer. It doesn't comply with normal structures, normal operations affecting world structures. So for example, in trade, the steel overcapacity comes about directly because of the nature of the Chinese regime and the way they set targets and the like. Cyberspace now should be another area. It utilizes foreign direct investment in a way that has some good parts. Building a road is a good thing for almost any country. Building a road with geopolitical requirements is not necessarily a good thing, and as was already mentioned, building a road which creates financing that puts too great a debt burden on the country in which the road is built is definitely not a good thing. So Belt and Road can be all right, but probably will have its major downsides, and we need to think about that. So when we come to Maldives, so what does it really mean for U.S. strategy? Well, we don't actually, as you all know, we don't actually have an ambassador resident physically in Maldives. It's in Sri Lanka, but although accredited to Maldives, we do have U.S. people there. So it gives you a sense that the U.S. is going to have to work closely with regional countries, and as I already said, work closely with India. It's terribly important for the United States to maintain freedom of navigation, and they're critical navigation two at least are key for much of the trade that moves through the Indian Ocean. Key to maintain the positive focus in the areas I talked about, but specifically I think when we go to some of the issues that was raised, we need really to raise the transparency with respect to what's going on. If you take a look, for example, at Transparency International's corruption indices, Maldives don't get a very good score. They get 33 out of 100. If you look at Freedom House's democratic scores, and this was before the recent set of activities, they didn't get a very good score, and the press is completely not fair. And of course, what just happened in the last month would lower it also. So putting a transparency light on this, and that would also affect what China does, would be very important. Thinking about how to counter ISIS, we have some real changes in other parts of the world. The Saudi Crown Prince, for example, is heavily focused on changing the nature of the way the Saudi regime looks with respect to the religion. We need to think about UN sanctions and the like. So the difficulty is, it is, quote, internal affairs. What degree of involvement is appropriate, what degree of involvement is practical. But I don't think we should forget about it. We shouldn't ignore it, even though it's a small element of U.S. policy in a certain sense. It implicates, I would say, much larger issues. So I'm going to stop there.
So, would you want to respond to anything?
I think we take more questions.
Okay. So we open it up to questions. In the interest of time, please keep them short. Okay, David.
So I've heard that this sea level rise is an issue, and I'm trying to find it. Curious of what the future plans for the Maldives, if that becomes an issue about where to relocate. I've heard that they have plans to acquire property in Western Australia, but I'm not sure of that. And if that is the case, I'm just curious to know. In Australia, where it's a secular, pluralist, Western-style democracy that recently approved the gay marriage and that kind of thing, how that would be compatible with the Islamic culture of Maldives? Should they decide they have to relocate to Australia? That's just. And I'm just wondering if do they have plans of relocation if sea level rise becomes an issue?
Any other questions? I'd like to. Yes.
We go ahead. Thank you. India Global Nature today. So, what would be the message as far as to the Chinese and to the Indians from here to the U.S.? And what stand you think U.S. should take as far as China and India is in the middle of this Maldives?
Thank you. Yes. With regard to relocation, sir, I think that would be the last choice, isn't it? Now that we have a lot of reclamation machines coming from China, we can actually raise the ground as well. But we've been doing reclamation for a long time in Maldives. But we feel that adaptation measures, softer adaptation measures, would actually be very useful in Maldives. So we are looking into that kind of adaptation measures. But acquiring land in another country and moving there would be our last choice, I think. It's not a choice, it's a desperate situation. So we have lived in Maldives for 3,000 over years, so we would like to stay there. And because everything is there in Maldives. So that would be the case. I think the solution to any solution to Maldives, what we are going through, the losing of democracy and all this, it's very important for countries like United States, India, Japan, Australia to work, to sit down together and work out something with the Maldivian people and find a way forward to it. I think President Yameen today is in a catch-22 situation. He can't get back into the constitution because he gets back into the constitution, then he's lost his presidency, which he needs very badly. And so we need to find a way, sir, to work around it and find some kind of solution, even for Yameen, the president, because we can't just tell him to get back to the constitution and then be that he won't do that. That is the problem. So he's adamant on remaining in power. So as long as he's adamant on remaining in power, and if we are not in a position to bring up the necessary pressure through targeted measures as advocated by the European Union, I think we are there for the long haul. And that will damage the country to an extent where we can't actually come back, because we'll be country that is like a banana republic. Will be a state without any principles. It will be a rogue state. Will be outside the international community. His principle and his what he has been doing is that anyone who criticizes his behavior, for example, the Commonwealth started putting pressure on the government of Maldives, he left Commonwealth. So if UN starts doing that, maybe he will leave UN. So with a man like that, we have to deal with. I think it's very important that we all work together to find a strategy for the sake of the Indian Ocean security. Maldives, through Maldivian channels, the three channels that we have, 1.5 degree channel, the 3 degree channel, and the 7 degree channel, which is just by India. Millions and millions and billions of dollars of cargo passes through every year. It is not a club point, but it is a point where the Southeast Asia's cargo goes to the Middle East oil comes through there. And so it's a very strategic place, and we can't let any chaotic situation happen there, and that will be detrimental to international trade, which is a threat to international security. I don't know how much I should emphasize this point, but I think everybody here who knows a little bit of geography about the Indian Ocean will understand the importance of how Maldives is strategically placed in the middle of the Indian Ocean. So it's important that we work out something together, whether in closed doors or whether in the open. We need to do something, and we can't let this situation go on like this and say that we can't find a cure for it. What I'm seeing today is that most of the major countries, major powers, we have the traditional beliefs that must not interfere in the internal affairs of the country. And that's what China says, must not interfere in the internal affairs of the country. But what is internal affairs? When it actually leads to the security threats to the international trade in Indian Ocean, neighboring countries, all that. So I think...
if I may interrupt, what would have been the ideal Indian response, let's say, when your party leader, very explicitly asked for something? What would have been a good response, in your opinion?
I think India responded very well. I think India is very... You see, we need India to be able to talk to this regime. Otherwise, we have lost everything. So India needs to be very articulate in dealing with this government. So if India goes to the too extreme and then brings out statements and puts out threats, I think that will be detrimental to our cause, and it will be detrimental to the entire process that we are. All these things, I believe, are processes. So it takes time and all that. But what is happening in Maldives today is we are short of time. This is the election year in Maldives. And I believe very strongly that President Yamin will not have an election. So he is buying time in order to say exactly that. He's delaying everything. Now, when United Nations wanted to sponsor talks between the opposition and the government in Maldives, he said, no, wait until after the 23rd. So I don't know what he's planning for until the 23rd. So he might have a very strange situation in Maldives where, you see, a dictator's ideal dictatorship is something that looks like a democracy. That's the ultimate achievement of a dictator. You have seen the examples of this. So we must be very careful what Yamin will be doing now. Unless we are able to address these issues and bring these issues to some kind of semblance of rule of law in the country, we are going to lose it. And if we lose it, I strongly believe that it's going to be a threat to that, for the reasons that I mentioned in my earlier statement. And nothing is in control. The fundamentalist elements of the Islamic world is penetrating into the country is to a great extent, and this will destabilize borders. If you actually actually see what's happening in the Comoros, in the Seychelles, even in Mauritius. Many countries ignore this and they don't want to talk about it. But even in India, the fundamental elements in Muslim fundamentalists in India are creeping in and they are making problems. The recent events in Kandy in Sri Lanka is an example. So all these type of things happening in this region actually gives more encouragement to the fundamentalist elements in Maldives. And unsteady or unreliable or completely out of control Maldives is detrimental to the Indian Ocean. And that is not what we want, and that has to be avoided by all means, in my opinion. We should talk together, we should talk with the United States, we should talk with Australia, we should talk with Japan, we should sit down and we must have a comprehensive policy to deal with this issue. And it's urgent, it's very important. That would be my thing. Yes, sir.
I'm definitely not an expert on the Indian Ocean, but and I very much take your call for action. I think the key question, and maybe you thought it through, and or for either Frank or you, Mr. Minster, is sort of what type of action do you think would be most effective? And then the Washingtonian in me says that the words ISIS and North Korea are particularly, potentially very catalyzing for the Trump administration, where when you said that there's a fleet of tankers that are busting North Korean sanctions, that really wakes people up here. In Washington, and when you talk about ISIS infiltrating security forces and this potentially being somewhat of a safe haven after Syria's relatively emptied out, that's also a very potentially catalyzing activity. I'm talking politics here and policy, not
Yes.
logic and rationality in some ways, but that's question one. And question two is, are there any lessons learned from similar crises, not necessarily even in the Indian Ocean, that can be applied to this urgent crisis? Albeit, each crisis like this is different, but are there other things that we should learn from similar instances elsewhere that might be applicable also to the Maldives?
I don't know if I can give any examples of this. Maldives case is very different. Maldives became a democracy by a homegrown system through democracy. We were not violent. We did not have bloodshed. We did nothing like that. It was just before the Arab Spring. And there are lessons to be learned from Maldives on this. And we have done things intelligently before, and I hope we are able to do things intelligently in the future. We don't want this government to fall on the streets of Bali, where things will go so chaotic that, in a small country like Maldives, this would not be a good idea at all. So we want to find a way to change this situation in Maldives through legitimate means, through the pressure. What United States could do, I'll give you an example. For example, in 2013, when the then government of Wahid, who was the vice president of former President Nasheed, he staged a coup and then came into power. And when he was refusing to hold elections, your ambassador gave very strong messages to him. Because we trade in US dollar. We do everything in US dollar. We have our money in United States. So she gave very strong messages, and within 18 hours, we had the election date. So you have that kind of power, you see, because we are, all our trade, whatever we export, whatever we earn, our entire tourism industry depends on the dollar. So you have leverages, you have possibilities, and these are very small issues compared to the problems that you have in other Indo-Pacific regions. And there's no comparison of Kashmir to Maldives, to India. That's nonsense, This is Kashmir is a different situation altogether. But this, I believe very strongly that United States and India are working together, even without any other country. I think this problem can be solved with strong messages. And the threat of these things will be enough to sway the government of Maldives, because that's the end of the road for Maldives president.
Just to add on, Barry, on the point you raised about both the tankers and ISIS, with respect to North Korea, there are existing international sanctions and U.S. laws that would allow for substantial activities against those tankers. Proliferation Security Initiative would be a framework, but as we've seen recently, tankers have been stopped on their way to North Korea, diverted, and probably a great deal could be done. Likewise, with respect to ISIS, there's a tremendous amount of both international and American law with respect to being able to seize finances and the like that are involved in any way, shape, or form, really, in terrorism support. I couldn't sit here and tell you how to do it, particularly because I'd have to know a lot more about what's going on in the Maldives, but our Treasury Department is quite good at that. So there are areas of pressure, and then if you don't always have to press them, you have to decide what you want. What is it that we actually want to have accomplished by the pressure? It's not the first country that has had a non-democratic government that has a authoritarian who wants to stay in power by pretending to be a Democrat. So the question would be, if the issue is to have free and fair elections, if that's what we're seeking, how to set it up so that they'd actually be free and fair as opposed to just sham. Use the pressure to get there. If it needs to be multiple step, I don't know enough about the country to set up the steps, but there are plenty of people in the U.S. State Department otherwise that do probably with assistance.
I would just say that here the context is China in the background, and China trying to sort of change the balance of power in the region. So yes, it's not the first country to have had a coup or an autocratic, ruler. But I think a lot of other geopolitical things are happening at the same time, which should be of concern to the US and India and all those who believe in the free and open order.
Sorry. Go ahead. There are three things that needs to be done in Maldives. One, we have to pressure the regime in Bali to abide by the ruling of the Supreme Court instead of putting the Supreme Court judges in the prison of 1st February ruling, and lift the state of emergency. Then remove the military from the parliament and let the parliament function properly. So these are the things that are actually necessary to be done. Once that happens, and there are people in the parliament, there are 12 members of the parliament who are sacked by the regime, which is illegal, and they need to be reinstated. And there are over 25 parliamentarians on whom cases are pending today, all on front of charges. Now, Parliament should function as a normal institution, as a democratic institution. Once the Parliament starts functioning, I think things will get in done, because all these things, it's a process, and then it will work. They must get the military out of the Parliament, implement the Supreme Court ruling, remove the SOE, state of emergency. These three things are the essential things that needs to be done, and this is where the pressure is needed. And we are not asking for heaven and everything, we are just asking for this. And if that is how, you can be assured that with the Indian Ocean, the state, which is very strategically located in the Indian Ocean, without democracy in that country, there is no guarantee, without transparency, there is no guarantee that this country will remain stable. democracy is the only instrument, democracy is the only thing that we know, the form of governance that will create stability in a country.
There's a question.
Yes, sir.
I'll just go back to the North Korean ships for a second here. About a week ago, the Japanese government charged that there were ships with Maldive flags that were being used to transit embargoed goods. And the policy the U.S. has been pursuing is whatever country's flag is being flown on that ship, the request to board a ship goes to the flag country. And I want to know if you think the Maldivian government would cooperate with the United States in that sort of scenario or not. Because if they don't, if you're worried about the U.S. taking a hostile view towards North Maldives, that would probably do it.
This matter was put to the Security Council of the United Nations by the Japanese government. And the Chinese said that there are a lot of investigations and clarity needed on this issue. And so therefore, to hang on until they do this thing. So that's where it stands. And if we have to accept all this kind of stuff, then it'll go on and on, isn't it? And I urge, you see, the Maldivian flag is there. It is the Maldivian, what do you call this, the code that is given for transmission from ship to shore, it's Maldivian. So this cannot be given to a ship that is not of Maldive flag. So it's obvious that it's a Maldivian vessel and it is registered in Maldives, whether President Yamin knows it or not. But then we also have information that it belongs to family members and that they applied for a loan, mortgage in this vessel. So I think we have ample clarity on that.
Aman?
Thank you, Minister. Thank you so much, Minister. My question is regarding what you discussed with Mr. before about India First policy. After the emergency was declared, the Yemen government sent envoys to Pakistan, to China, and to Saudi Arabia, but not to India. Do you think, what implications do you think that has for the India First policy, and do you think it's sliding into a China First policy on part of the Yemen government?
I think you know the answer to that, because Maldives requested to meet the foreign minister and the foreign secretary when they were out of India, so they couldn't give a time. So after that, the Indian government told the Maldivian government that they are out, they're not in Delhi, so we have to fix it at the time. And then after that, conveniently, it was ignored. So that's where it stands. So obviously, in my opinion, it is China first policy now. And besides, India is a democracy. And I don't know how fondly the present dictator, Yamin, looks at democracies. And so this is I think the only mountain that he can lean against today is China. I think that's where he is. So I don't think he has any other.
There's a question.
Yes.
Yashwant from Sun Times. Minister, as you said, China is part of the whole game now. Are you in the opposition in touch with Chinese leaders or the country? Are you speaking to them also? You're obviously in contact with Indians and the US, but are you also speaking to the Chinese as opposition?
We do have contact with the Chinese. Yes, it's you see, China in the Indian Ocean is a geopolitical reality, isn't it? So we must be stupid if we don't have some connection with China and if we don't talk to them. Yes, sir.
So are they in favor of removing the president, or they want the president to stay? What kind of feedback? What are you hearing from them?
The public feedback is that they don't want to interfere. That it's not their policy to interfere with the internal affairs of the country.
What's the back channel message you're getting from them?
That we can talk to them. Yes.
Nilanthi.
Minister. Minister. I wanted to follow up on your statement about Chinese land grabs in Maldives and how they're keen to build a base. Could you specify which islands the Chinese have, land grabbed, and especially where they plan to build a base?
They are very interested in investing, and the entire Indo-Pacific atoll, which is the northernmost atoll, which is only 70 miles from Minicoy, which is Indian territory. This has been allocated to China for development. And the last time this announcement was made, India made a big fuss about it, and then it was quietened down. So still that remains as it is. So we are concerned that this may happen. Indo-Pacific atoll is an isolated, separate atoll from the northernmost atolls in Maldives. So that is one. And there are 16 islands that are under Chinese at the moment. And China has put in proposals to build bunkering and alongside port facility in Gadu Island. Gadu Island is at the mouth of the 1.5 degree channel in Maldives. 1.5 degree channel is where it's a international shipping route. So this is a very, very important place. All the people in Gadu Island have been removed from the island, and they've been moved to Funadu Island, which is close by there. So all indications are that with the new elections, or with Yamin getting the upper hand and remaining in power, that these things will become reality. And Makurdu Island, in the western side of Maldives, has already been given, according to all the information that we have, to China to build this underwater, what you mentioned, Seema?
The observation.
Observation post. And that this agreement was signed in Beijing last year, when President Yamin went to China to sign all this. 15 different agreements were signed, and some MOUs. We have no clarity on exactly what agreements. So these are some of the things that we know about and the government has published. These are big concerns. You know, you are from Sri Lanka, aren't you?
No.
You are Savarnayaka.
I'm from the U.S.
You're from the US, but your ancestors are, your people are from Sri Lanka. You must know that what happened in Ahmedabad port. You see, that was $1 billion, and Sri Lanka found it impossible to pay back. We are already in debt to China for $1.2 billion. How can we pay this? So land grab is land grab. And I explained to you what land grab is, and I have some papers on land grab which I can give to the to this organization here. China today owns 53% of the entire Cambodia. 53%. Without firing a single shot, they managed to grab land. If you compare the East India Company, they never had this good. They never had this much of land in the world. Many African countries have given their land to China, and they are in this trap. So it's a dangerous development. So without any military interventions or anything like that, through supporting, propping up dictators, and through various under-the-table means, I'll be very frank here on these issues. And we know that in Maldives they did exactly that. And so we are in a very, very dangerous situation. And this is not something new that happened with China in Maldives. It happened everywhere. It probably happened in Sri Lanka. It probably happened in many countries in Africa. So they find a person, they feed the person, and it becomes habit.
And his next generation.
And so this is how it is.
But in this town now, the headlines are, did we get China wrong? So maybe there's hope. Maybe there's a rethink on how to deal with China.
What is that question?
Did we get China wrong? That's been the headline in The Economist and several other.
Can I just, Lalija from PTI, Press Trust of India. Did India get China wrong in Maldives?
Did China get?
Did India get China wrong in Maldives? Was India not aware of what China is doing in Maldives?
I think India has been very articulate in dealing in Maldives. Because India needs to be talking to this regime in Maldives. India needs to send the right messages. I think they are doing that from to the knowledge that we have. We have very close connection with India. We are working very closely with India. And I don't think they should go to an extent where Maldivian government is not talking to India. I think that is that is dangerous for Maldives today. So what my feeling is that we should have a joint effort in dealing with this issue and not leave it only to India.
Joint departments, US, India.
Yes, people who have any stake in the Indian Ocean and people who are concerned about Indian Ocean trade, people who are concerned about Indian Ocean security, people. Diego Garcia is only 200 miles from Maldives.
I believe Mr. Hamid would like to say a few words.
Yes, yes, cool. If Mr. Hamid is a legal person, and if you have any questions on the state of emergency and what damages it is doing to the country and to the democracy of the country and how we are entrapped in this, that we are unable to get out of it, and what solutions or what remedies could be possible under this circumstances, so Hamid would be able to be. Is that all right? Is there a question on state of emergency in Maldives and what?
Karen?
I do have a question. So obviously there are demonstrations in the streets of Male continuing
Yes.
just this week. How are you how is information communicated through the Maldives? If you're concerned about freedom of the press, how is information getting out? How are you able to communicate with opposition supporters in Maldives or across the country?
We have WhatsApp, we have Viber, we have so many. You see, Maldives is a population of 460,000 people. We have more than 250,000 active people in social media. And almost everyone is literate. So it's very easy. We conduct our campaigns through social media. We pass out messages in social media, mass messages goes to all our activists and everybody. So we are quite savvy with this. So it's easy for us to communicate. And anyone who has an iPhone and we have an iPhone, we also can go on what do you call this? FaceTime. FaceTime or Face Audio. That's all.
If there are no more, yes, sir.
Well, I'm Admiral Vattala from Sri Lankan Embassy, Defense Attaché. I have a doubt to clear because when you all were in government, didn't you see this coming? When did you see this coming, in the sense when the previous assignment when I had in the Navy before I came here, as the operation, we were working with the US Embassy very closely, and we were hearing with the Indian defense establishments also, especially as far as radicalization is concerned, things are not going to be well in Maldives. And on the other hand, I would like to compare, maybe I'm wrong, but then the similar situation in South China Sea, where what we call the Great Zone deterrence, in an area where you have no conflict but no peace also, the way that wherever I go and whatever that I hear in DC, in every think tank, it seems that US have now understood that they were a little bit late in Great Zone deterrence. Isn't it the same thing in Maldives, where you had some prior knowledge of what is coming, but then along with India and US or whatever, even Japan didn't got the act together to deter at the right time and take corrective measures?
You see, we were trying to deal with these issues of Islamic fundamentalism and Judaism.